Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about a neighbor who thinks that her cousin will get access to my land. My property wasn't large, but it had the right layout for me. A comfortable living room, enough bedrooms for guests, and a tiny backyard that somehow seemed to fit my personality perfectly. One of the biggest selling points was that the previous owner had recently paved 2 solid parking spaces at the side of the house, which made it easy for anyone living there to park without hassle. I recall standing on the walkway that first day, thinking how fortunate I was to find a house that felt so much like home so quickly. When I finally signed the papers and got the keys, I believed all my neighborly relations would be smooth sailing. Little did I know that assumption would be tested in a way I could never have imagined. From the outside, the neighborhood seemed peaceful. Every house had its own distinct character, some with flamboyant color schemes, others with wide front porches or carefully tended lawns. Mine was one of the more modest ones, yet it had a welcoming feel. Across the street lived an older couple who appeared sweet, always waving when they saw me. 2 houses down stood a family with 3 small kids, often playing in the yard. Then, right next door was a large piece of property that dwarfed mine in both yard size and house size. From a distance, it seemed more like a mini estate. It had a wide driveway big enough for multiple cars, a neatly trimmed hedge that enclosed the backyard, and a front lawn that felt expansive compared to my modest patch of grass. The home belonged to a woman named Claudette, or so I was told by the realtor. I didn't see her around much when I moved in. The few times I did see someone walking on that property, I couldn't tell if it was Claudette or a guest of hers. I figured we'd eventually cross paths under normal neighborly circumstances, like taking out the trash at the same time or picking up mail at the curb. But as the weeks went by, I found it peculiar that I never once had a chance to say a simple hello. The first real interaction with Claudette happened about a month into my residence. It was a bright Sunday morning, and I was on my porch polishing an old rocking chair I had inherited from my grandfather. The sunlight was perfect for checking every last speck of dust on that chair. Suddenly, I saw a woman approaching my property line. She had a rather purposeful stride, as though she was on a mission. I set down the polishing cloth and stood up to greet her, expecting the usual neighborly banter. "Hello, I'm so-and-so. I live next door. Nice to meet you." She had long, dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and wore a serious expression that immediately put me on edge. Instead of friendly pleasantries, she barely nodded before launching into a rather abrupt statement. "You must be the new owner," she said, eyeing me up and down. "I'm Claudette. I live next door." She paused as though waiting for me to say something, but my mind was still in that polite greeting mode, so I just nodded and said, "Pleased to meet you." She tilted her head. "Well, here's the thing," she continued. "I have a cousin, Philip, who used to park on this land whenever he visited. That was when the previous owner lived here, of course. And because he's got a new sports car, he needs a decent parking space. My driveway is already taken up by my husband's truck and my kids' 2 cars. So I'm letting you know in advance that he'll be coming by next weekend and parking right here." She pointed to the exact spot where I always parked my own car. At first I thought maybe I misheard her or that there was some confusion in translation. Her tone was so matter-of-fact, as though I had no say in the matter. I blinked for a moment, then politely explained, "I'm sorry, but that's my parking space. I've got 2 cars myself, 1 daily driver and 1 vintage project car. And besides, this property isn't large enough to accommodate someone else's vehicle on a regular basis." That's when her face twisted slightly with what I can only describe as disbelief, maybe even annoyance. She waved her hand dismissively and said, "It was never an issue before. The guy who lived here used to let my cousin park anytime. We were basically used to it. This is how it's always been." I knew from the moment she said that I was probably in for an unwelcome conflict. The sense of entitlement was practically dripping from her words. Still, I tried to keep my voice calm. "I understand it might have been the arrangement with the previous owner," I said, "but I'm not comfortable with that. My property is actually quite small, and my driveway only holds 2 cars. I also pay property tax based on the idea that this land is solely mine, so I'm not sure why I have to accommodate a stranger's car." Claudette's eyes narrowed. "You do realize I have a large family, right? My cousin shouldn't have to park on the street. We live in a nice neighborhood. Parking on the street might attract thieves or cause accidents. It's a risk for his new sports car." The logic felt twisted. I tried to explain my side a second time, but she cut me off with, "We'll see about that." I watched as she turned sharply on her heel and stormed back to her property. The entire exchange left me feeling uneasy. I was new to the area, and the last thing I wanted was to have a feud with someone right next door. But her assumption that my land was open for her cousin's convenience didn't sit right. I reassured myself that most people, given time, would come to see reason. After all, I was just stating a fairly typical boundary. Please don't park on my property. Surely she would accept that eventually. But the pit in my stomach warned me that might be too optimistic. Over the next week, I went about my business, heading to work every morning, returning in the evenings, and occasionally waving to other neighbors as I took out the trash. No new confrontations happened. I even started thinking maybe Claudette realized the demand was unreasonable and had decided to drop it. Little did I know, she was simply biding her time, or perhaps planning something behind the scenes. The following weekend arrived with a spectacularly clear sky, and I had errands to run that Saturday morning. I remember double-checking that I locked the front door and made sure everything was secure, because I was going to be out for most of the day. My plan was to meet a friend for brunch, then drive to a local farmer's market for fresh produce. By the time I got home, it would probably be late afternoon, and I intended to use part of the evening to work on my vintage car, which was parked in my second space. I left around 9 a.m., thinking nothing of it. However, I returned just a little after 4 p.m. to a sight that made my jaw drop. In my 2 parking spaces, both of them, sat vehicles I had never seen before. One was a flashy red sports car that looked brand new, as if it had just rolled off the dealership lot. The other was a hefty SUV, tinted windows, the works. Both were parked haphazardly, as if whoever drove them just pulled in without a care in the world. My immediate thought was, did someone break in? Then I realized exactly whose cousin probably owned that sports car. My irritation rose rapidly. I pulled my car up to the curb, the only spot I could find near my house, and got out. As I approached, I couldn't help but notice that the vehicles were indeed blocking my usual parking, and the sports car was partially on my lawn. The nerve! I stormed into my house, half expecting a note on the door or some explanation, but there was nothing. I tossed my keys on the kitchen table, took a breath to calm myself, and decided I should at least knock on Claudette's door to see if she had an explanation. It felt like the straightforward thing to do, but the lingering bitterness inside me warned that I might not get any polite conversation out of her. I walked next door, rang the doorbell, and waited. A moment later, Claudette opened the door. She seemed momentarily startled to see me, but then put on a sort of smug half-smile. Before I could even speak, she said, "Oh, you're back earlier than I thought. Everything okay?" The innocent tone was clearly insincere. I gestured over to my driveway. "Your cousin's car and another vehicle are blocking my spaces. I need them moved right away." She crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe. "I assumed you wouldn't mind," she said, "especially since you told me you'd be out most of the day. My cousin wanted to come by, and he brought his friend who also needed somewhere to park. It's no big deal. They'll only be there for a few hours." I was stunned. "No big deal?" I repeated. "Claudette, this is my private property, not free overflow parking for your visitors. I told you last week that I don't want anyone parking there. This is over the line." She brushed it off like I was being overly dramatic. "Well, look, they're already parked. Why not let them stay for now? They'll leave later this evening. It's just for today." The casualness of her response made my blood boil. "What happens if I want to go out again? Or if I have a friend coming over who needs a spot?" I demanded. "You can park on the street, can't you?" She shot back, an air of superiority creeping into her tone. I left her porch furious, telling her in no uncertain terms that the cars needed to be moved immediately. She didn't budge. Instead, she shrugged and closed the door, essentially shutting me out. I tried knocking again, but she ignored me. My frustration soared to new heights. I realized this wasn't an innocent misunderstanding. This was her brazenly trampling on my rights as a property owner. Feeling both helpless and enraged, I pulled out my phone, walked back to my house, and phoned a local towing company. If they wouldn't move on their own, then I would let the law handle it. While waiting for the tow trucks, I paced around my driveway, occasionally glancing at the cars. A part of me worried about potential retaliation, but I felt strongly that I had every right to reclaim my parking spaces. About 30 minutes later, a large tow truck rumbled onto my street. Another arrived shortly afterward. The drivers stepped out, and I explained the situation, showing them my property lines and pointing out that these cars did not belong to me. They agreed to tow, just as I expected. One driver even commented, "You're definitely in the right. We see this sometimes, but it's usually with random strangers, not neighbors." That small validation eased some of my tension. As the tow truck operators were getting ready to hitch the cars, I saw Claudette running out from her house in a panic, yelling, "Stop! What are you doing? You can't tow those." I calmly replied that I could, in fact, tow them because they were trespassing. She started shouting about how I was petty and how she was going to call the police. The drivers looked to me, unsure if they should proceed, but I nodded for them to continue. Claudette disappeared back into her house. I assumed she was calling the police or perhaps calling her cousin. Either way, the first truck got the sports car hitched up. Then, just as the second was about to deal with the SUV, 2 police cruisers turned onto our street. Officers stepped out and Claudette was quick to run up and talk to them. I approached as well, explaining the entire scenario. At first, the officers seemed a bit confused. Usually, parking disputes happen on public streets, not private driveways. But once they understood that the cars were indeed on my property without my permission, one of them raised an eyebrow at Claudette. "Ma'am," he said, "are these vehicles yours?" Claudette immediately shook her head. "No, they belong to my cousin and his friend," she explained. "But they have a right to be here. The previous homeowner let them park whenever they wanted." The officer looked over at me and asked, "Do you allow them to park on your property?" I said no, absolutely not. Then the officer turned back to Claudette with a rather surprised expression. "Ma'am, you're aware this is private property, correct? The land belongs to your neighbor, not you. That means he can have unauthorized vehicles towed at any time if he chooses." Claudette's face showed anger, frustration, and disbelief. She pointed at me, saying I was unreasonable, didn't care about the community, and that letting people park was a neighborly courtesy. Thankfully, the officer kept his cool and repeated that I had all legal rights. Claudette then claimed that the sports car was too expensive to park on the street and that she was trying to protect the neighborhood's image. The officer shrugged and said, "That's not how property rights work, ma'am." He requested my permission to tow. The trucks removed the vehicles after I agreed. That should have been enough, but Claudette was furious. She warned me that I had started a war and to prepare for the consequences. It was dramatic, but her personality made me expect her to escalate. Only the police's confirmation that the cars were towed legally consoled me. I told myself that Claudette might ignore me or send me mean letters to calm my nerves. I had no idea how far she would go. That night, I heard heated arguments next door. Claudette, her husband, and possibly her cousin spoke, and I heard outrageous, my property, and he can't do that. I tried to ignore it. I always relaxed by working on my vintage car. The whole situation was heavy. I considered installing a security camera or posting no trespassing signs to prevent future incidents. I installed a basic security camera system the next day. The cameras I bought were easy to mount around my house, covering my driveway and small backyard. I justified it as precaution. Today, insurance cameras are common. Deep down, I thought my neighbor might try something else. I was right. My trash cans were repeatedly knocked over a week later. Garbage once littered my driveway. My first thought was that my neighbor was playing tricks on me. Another morning, I saw a broken branch in the small tree near my front porch. The break appeared deliberate, but it could have been from a storm. Each incident may have been a coincidence, but they all felt like low-level harassment. One morning, I checked the footage and saw someone sneaking onto my property at night. It was hard to identify the figure in the hoodie, but they kicked my trash can over. They also searched my car for unlocked doors. Although the footage didn't show a face, the silhouette resembled Claudette's husband, Morris, who was tall and stocky. I was furious but relieved to have proof. Thinking I might confront them or go to the police, I printed video stills. I consulted my friend Charlotte, a paralegal in a small downtown law firm, before acting. She was no lawyer, but she knew enough about property disputes to advise me. She suggested keeping records of each incident, dates, times, and evidence if I wanted the police involved. Claudette or her family could escalate, and I would have a paper trail. After taking the advice, I kept a journal of suspicious events like the vandalized tree branch, trash incidents, and unauthorized attempts to unlock my car. I tried to continue my routine. I worked at a local marketing agency during a major campaign launch. I didn't need home drama to distract me from my demanding boss. Keeping your mind off that is hard. I feared returning from work to slashed tires or broken windows, but the cameras gave me some peace of mind. I could always check the footage. Some weeks of peace passed. Hoped the drama had subsided. One night, while watching a documentary in my living room, I heard a loud, frantic knock at my door. A visibly upset woman from down the street appeared through the window. I knew her face from neighborhood barbecues, but not well. When I opened the door, she looked pale and apologized for bothering me. She said she had just seen Claudette and her husband outside argumentating about getting even with me. The woman worried the tension would turn violent. I was warned to be careful because the husband had been drinking and bragging about how nobody was going to push them around. I thanked her for the heads up. I immediately checked my cameras after she left but found nothing unusual. The situation was unsettling. I locked my doors, closed my blinds, and called the local police non-emergency line to report the incident. My officer advised me to call 911 if I felt threatened or saw them trespassing again. He also reminded me that I could file a restraining order if they were a threat. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios that night. I wondered if moving was worthwhile. I had just bought this house and loved it, except for the neighbors. The neighbors were nice, the commute to work was good, and the environment was comfortable. I was furious that one person's unreasonableness could make me reconsider staying. I stood my ground to avoid being bullied off my property. If Claudette or her family kept pushing me, I would use all legal means. Next week, a surprise twist occurred. A black SUV greeted me at home after work. A suit-clad middle-aged man exited. He introduced himself as Emery, Claudette, and her husband's real estate attorney. He gave me a letter stating they would dispute our property line. Their claim was that my driveway may have extended onto shared land, which Claudette believed allowed her cousin to park. This was a lie. My deed clearly defined my property lines, and the previous owner put in those 2 parking spaces because they were within the boundary. Unbelievable audacity. Emery tried to act professional, but when I questioned the claim's basis, I could see his confidence break. He said they weren't sure of the boundary but had substantial reason to believe I was infringing on communal space. I mentioned sending the letter to my lawyer. He nodded sharply and left. I wondered how much Claudette was wasting on a bad legal move. I immediately called Charlotte to update her. She laughed bitterly when I told her what was happening. She said, "They're trying to intimidate you. They probably think you'll give in rather than fight the law. The boundary laws are strict." She advised me to contact a local real estate attorney to respond, which I did. Attorney Rowan was direct and efficient. He immediately rejected Claudette's claim after reviewing my deed. He wrote a letter telling them to stop or face harassment lawsuits. I felt relief for the first time in weeks. I wasn't a lawyer, but having someone on my side felt good. Claudette kept campaigning. This cul-de-sac had a small homeowners association that mostly oversaw architectural standards and communal landscaping. She complained to it. Her complaint claimed my security cameras violated an obscure covenant about maintaining neighborhood aesthetics. An HOA representative investigated. Wanda, a polite older woman, seemed embarrassed to check. I explained the situation, showed her the cameras, and showed that they were only pointed at my property. Wanda understood that homeowners can install security devices for protection. She left, promising to write a note confirming my compliance. The visit felt like Claudette's annoyance. Despite these attempts, I persisted. I would stay even if she wanted me gone. 2 weeks later, parking disputes arose again. Claudette's cousin had a new friend with a flashier sports car, so they decided to host a mini car meet at her house. I went to work early and returned around lunchtime to get some forgotten files. My stomach sank as I turned onto my street. 3 sports cars partially blocked my driveway. The first car was in my driveway, the second half on the curb, and the third behind it. That felt like intentional boxing out. I was furious, but I felt calm, as if I had seen this before and knew the script. I parked down the street, went home, and called the towing company again, explaining that these cars were on my property without permission. Again, tow trucks arrived. As expected, Claudette stormed out, screaming at the drivers that they had no right to take the cars. It was a near repeat of the first fiasco. But this time, I had notified the local police of ongoing trespassing. 2 officers from the previous response arrived and warned Claudette. One even suggested that she could be charged with disturbing the peace or harassment if she kept causing disputes. After the cars were towed, she stood on the curb, red-faced and furious. I talked to other neighbors to get perspective. A family 2 doors down told me Claudette pushed boundaries. She once tried to host a child's birthday party in another neighbor's garden, claiming that it had better sunlight and was just one afternoon. The neighbor refused, and Claudette was outraged but eventually relented. She had never parked on someone's property or filed a lawsuit. They wondered if her temper was deteriorating. Another neighbor suggested Claudette's personal life was chaotic. causing her to act out. Despite my empathy, I couldn't justify her blatant disregard for my rights. A local news blogger who covered minor neighborhood disputes and human interest stories heard about the drama and came around to ask questions a few weeks later, escalating the tension. Although I never gave him an official interview, I did say I felt harassed and worried about the situation next door. He reportedly tried to talk to Claudette, but she called him a busybody. The local online paper published an article a few days later about a situation suspiciously similar to ours. A homeowner battles a neighbor's repeated attempts to commandeer driveway space. Reading it made me uneasy because it publicly exposed what I wanted to keep private, but it was also validating. Others would probably see how unreasonable Claudette was. Saturday afternoon was the final breaking point. My parents visited from out of state. Showing them my new home made me proud to finally have a place to entertain them. The vintage car I was restoring in my second parking spot fascinated my dad. As we admired my work under the hood on the driveway, Claudette's voice came from behind us. She entered my property without permission. She cut in, "Oh, entertaining guests now, are we? Let me guess, they'll require more parking, right?" My dad, confused, asked, "Is there a problem?" Introduced him to Claudette, briefly describing her. My mother politely inquired about my well-being. Claudette scowled. "No, everything is wrong. Your child refuses neighborliness." Stepping between my parents and Claudette, I inhaled. I told her, "Please step off my property. I'm warning you one last time." Instead of leaving, she went on a rant about how I had ruined her cousin's life by charging him tow fees, that I was tarnishing the neighborhood, and that she had a right to park because the old owner let them. My parents were stunned. My calm dad snapped, "Lady, this is private property. If you don't leave now, we'll call the police." Claudette stared at me in rage, then turned around and marched back to her yard. My parents stared at me, wondering if this was normal. I had to recount everything. Their worries were great. As if things weren't tense enough, Claudette's husband, Morris, appeared in my backyard while I showed my mother my small garden patch that evening. He remained silent and sullen. My anxious mother grabbed my arm. I informed them that they were on private property. "Leave or I'm calling the police." He muttered, "You'll be sorry." He left. My mom was so upset she suggested we pack up and stay at a hotel, but I declined. I told her I was done being scared. I drove to the police station the next morning to file a trespassing and harassment complaint. My security camera screenshots showed when they entered my property without permission, and I included logs of every incident: trash vandalism, boundary dispute letter, repeated illegal parking. I thought the officer took my statement seriously, given his behavior. He warned me that Claudette or her husband could be charged if they continued. The turning point was ultimate. I saw 2 officers enter Claudette's house a few days later from a police car. Stayed about an hour. Sometimes I looked out and saw a heated argument in the living room. Officers eventually left. Claudette was on her porch staring at me with a look of defeat and hatred after they left. I avoided involvement. From then on, aggression decreased. No more trespassing, midnight trash can attacks, or cars in my driveway. Because neighbors looked at me differently, some worried, some sympathetic. Word must have spread around the block. However, I was relieved that the daily tension was easing. In subsequent weeks, my real estate attorney, Mr. Rowan, wrote a strong cease and desist letter and delivered it to Claudette's attorney, Emery. If harassment continued, I would file a civil lawsuit. It also sought reimbursement for my attorney fees defending myself against the baseless boundary dispute. Given my evidence, Mr. Rowan thought we could win if necessary. After a month, Claudette stopped responding and rambling. Though eerie, the quiet was welcome. I learned from a neighbor that Claudette's cousin was furious about having to retrieve his sports car from the impound lot and had incurred large fees. He threatened to sue me or the tow company, but nothing happened. Another rumor suggested Claudette and Morris were having marital problems due to stress from this ordeal. I don't like anyone's problems, but I think they could have avoided this if they'd respected others' property. Claudette unexpectedly listed her house a few months later. The sign went up one Saturday morning, and I felt oddly relieved. On hard nights, I daydreamed about a for sale sign on that big property next door. She reportedly moved closer to her extended family. But who knows if it was true or if our block was too tense. A moving truck arrived at her driveway after she found a buyer in a few weeks. From my window, I watched them load furniture. She left without saying goodbye, not that I expected. A young, friendly couple moved in next door. They introduced themselves, made no demands, and asked basic questions like the best grocery store. The vibe was drastically different. It felt good to breathe again. When my parents returned, they were amazed at how calm everything was. My mother joked, "Now you can enjoy being a homeowner." She was right. I cleaned up my yard, planted shrubs, and hung a wind chime near the porch. Normalcy returned slowly. Sometimes I checked the security camera feed out of habit, half expecting to see a car in my driveway. Thank goodness that era ended. I learned the hard way to stand up for myself. I wanted to be flexible, a good neighbor, and peaceful as a new homeowner. However, neighborly kindness is different from exploiting it. Claudette and her cousin ignored boundaries and laws and treated my property as their own. They retaliated with vandalism and fake lawsuits after I refused to cave. I had to fight harder than expected to protect my home and rights. In a strange twist, the trouble strengthened our street connections. They came to my aid with advice and moral support as the conflict escalated. A few neighbors said they were glad someone stood up to Claudette after previous minor encounters. The unpleasant situation taught me the value of community solidarity. We may not be best friends, but we can defend each other and decency. Now life is peaceful. Each evening I pull into my driveway without worrying about who might be there. My security cameras are kept for precaution and home safety. The vintage car restoration is going well. I drove it around the block last weekend and it runs great. I still shake my head at Claudette's claim that her cousin deserved to park in my driveway. Amazing how entitlement can lead someone astray. This experience taught me to document everything, stay calm, and don't let bullies get you. I learned that principle after many headaches, tense standoffs, and thousands of dollars in legal fees. I don't regret defending my property rights. Knowing I no longer have to fight for my driveway is worth all the stress. Sometimes you have to fight for what's yours, especially when others try to change the rules. Friends, thank you. See you soon.